$5.2 billion, 36 hours, and a significant portion of it gone. Not to enemy combatants, not to hardened bunkers, to decoys, elaborate, pre-planted fakes that had been scattered across the country months before the first bomb fell. Let that settle for a moment. The most advanced military in human history fired precision-guided munitions that cost anywhere from $250,000 to several $1 million per unit, at targets that were, in the words of defense analysts briefing their clients this week, empty fields dressed up to look important. The Iranians had moved everything. They dispersed, hidden, and replaced their real assets with theater, and the United States fired first and verified second. Now, on the surface, this operation looked like a display of overwhelming strength, speed, shock, and awe. Nearly 900 coordinated strikes in the first 12 hours, B-52 Stratofortresses, stealth fighters, full naval assets deployed across the Persian Gulf. But step back from the explosions for a moment and ask a much more uncomfortable question. What if this operation didn't weaken America's rivals at all? What if, in the process of trying to crush one adversary in the Middle East, Washington just handed its biggest geopolitical competitor the strategic opportunity of the decade? Because while the world was watching bombers light up the night sky, something else was happening quietly in the background, something far more important than the explosions themselves. China was watching, not just watching the war, studying it, recording it, learning from it in real time. Every missile launch, every radar signal, every supply chain disruption, every moment of political hesitation, all of it becoming data. And in modern warfare, data is power. But before we get to China, we need to destroy a narrative that is currently circulating across Washington think tanks and cable news panels with alarming confidence. Because if you believe this narrative, you are being set up. Here is how the story goes. The United States launches the operation. Nearly 900 strikes. The message to China: we will strangle your energy supply. We took Venezuela off the table, punch 1. Now we take Iran, punch 2. China's economy buckles. America reasserts dominance. Game over. It fits on a bumper sticker, and it is dangerously, catastrophically wrong. Here is why. China has achieved an energy self-sufficiency rate of 84%. Read that again. For every unit of energy China consumes, only 16% comes from abroad. That number has been climbing by design, the product of a deliberate 2-decade national strategy, massive investment in solar, wind, nuclear, hydroelectric infrastructure, and the largest electric vehicle fleet on the planet. They set out in the year 2000 to dominate electric vehicles. They began scaling renewable energy before most Western governments had written a policy paper. Their electricity production today dwarfs that of the United States. So when you hear that America is trying to strangle China's energy supply, you need to ask, what supply exactly? Within that remaining 16% of imported energy, oil makes up about 59%. Of China's total oil imports, roughly 17% comes from Iran. Run those numbers through and you arrive at a figure that should make every architect of this war lose sleep. China depends on Iranian energy for approximately 1.5% of its total energy consumption. 1.5%. That is what we launched a war over. And before you conclude that at least 1.5% is something, a pressure point, a lever, you need to understand what China has already built to make even that number irrelevant. Beijing constructed what analysts are calling a shadow fleet, roughly 18% of total global tanker capacity operating entirely outside standard regulatory frameworks. These vessels reflag mid-voyage. They rename themselves. They disable their tracking systems. They conduct ship-to-ship transfers in obscured waters off Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam, rebranding Iranian crude before it ever enters Chinese customs data. Since 2022, Chinese customs has officially reported 0 direct oil imports from Iran. 0. Meanwhile, analytical firms tracking actual tanker movements confirm over 1.38 million barrels per day still flowing. Current intelligence estimates suggest up to 300 million barrels of unsold oil are sitting on shadow tankers right now. A floating strategic reserve that no satellite can easily count and no sanction can easily reach. Combined with onshore reserves estimated at 100 to 115 days of net import cover, Beijing has built a buffer that can absorb months of disruption without the Chinese economy feeling a single tremor. This is not improvisation. This is not crisis management. This is a system that was engineered, tested, and refined over years specifically for the scenario that Washington just triggered. Now let's talk about who was actually hurt by disrupting the Strait of Hormuz, because it was not who you were told. Japan gets 91% of its oil through that waterway. The Philippines, 94%. 20 million barrels flow through Hormuz daily, and 80% of that volume is destined for Asian markets. These are not adversaries. These are the cornerstone allies of the American Indo-Pacific strategy, the very nations Washington needs on its side for any serious confrontation with China over Taiwan. As Professor John Mearsheimer put it with surgical precision, it is Japan and South Korea that are going to be clobbered. They are more dependent on Gulf oil than the Chinese are. The United States set out to weaponize the Strait of Hormuz against China. What it actually did was conduct an act of friendly fire against every energy-dependent ally it needs for its specific strategy. Daily charter rates for tankers have soared above $400,000. Brent crude surged past $90 a barrel with projections of $150 or higher if the strait remains disrupted. Meanwhile, China is accelerating negotiations for the Power of Siberia 2 natural gas pipeline with Russia, using Moscow as a safety valve to offset Middle Eastern volatility. The crisis is catalyzing exactly what Washington feared most: a secure land-based Eurasian energy corridor between China and Russia, built at the direct expense of the Gulf region, America just destabilized. The blockade strategy is not failing. It already failed. And Venezuela, that first punch everyone celebrated. According to reporting from the South China Morning Post, Venezuelan oil is still being sold to China. The only difference is that the United States is now doing the selling through offshore accounts. The profits changed hands. The oil did not. That is the story nobody is telling on cable news. Now let's talk about the war itself. The Iranians came prepared. Not partially prepared. Systematically, professionally, comprehensively prepared. Decoy targets, hidden assets, dispersed infrastructure, and a brutal exchange rate logic that is bleeding American munitions inventory in a way that replenishment cycles cannot keep up with. Iranian drones cost thousands of dollars, tens of thousands on the high end. Sheet metal, simple guidance, mass-produced. The United States is firing multi-million-dollar interceptor missiles to shoot them down. Iran has an estimated 45,000 missiles remaining and perhaps 50,000 to 100,000 drones. The United States started this campaign with an estimated 8,000 to 9,000 high-end munitions and has burned through at least half. Patriot missiles are not artillery rounds. You cannot surge production overnight. The replenishment pipeline is measured in months, not weeks. And here is the part that should stop you cold: the rare earth minerals, the gallium, the precision semiconductors needed to rebuild that inventory. China controls those supply chains. The country Washington is trying to weaken controls the materials Washington needs to replace the weapons it is burning to weaken it. History gives us no comfort here either. There is no example in modern warfare of an air campaign alone producing regime change. Not in Korea, where America firebombed the North into rubble and they did not quit. Not in Vietnam, where bombing continued for years and America lost anyway. Not even in Japan, where a single night of firebombing in March 1945 killed more people than either atomic bomb. And Japan still didn't surrender until August, with most historians attributing that decision to the Soviet ground invasion of Manchuria, not the bombs. You want regime change in Iran, you need boots on the ground. Iran is 4 times the size of Iraq with 93 million people, and even this administration is smart enough to understand that sending a ground force into Iran would be a generational catastrophe. So the war is being prosecuted with air power alone. The one tool that history tells us, without a single exception, does not achieve what is being asked of it. Meanwhile, China is not scrambling. China is collecting. The People's Liberation Army publicly posted 5 lessons drawn from observing this conflict. Publicly, that is not an accident. It is a message to Washington, to regional powers, and most precisely, to Taiwan. Lesson 1. Beware the enemy within. The surgical strikes on Iranian leadership were made possible through deep human intelligence. Agents embedded inside the country, knowing schedules, knowing that senior leaders were meeting in daylight under the assumption that strikes would only come at night. Beijing looked at that and saw a mirror. Espionage prosecutions in Taiwan have surged from 16 cases in 2021 to 64 in 2024. Beijing is already running that playbook. Lesson 2. Diplomacy under Washington is a trap. Reports indicated Iran had agreed to zero uranium stockpiling and full verification in the days before the bombs fell. Chinese state media published an editorial stating plainly that diplomacy with Washington is not a forum for sovereign equals. It is an instrument of dominant power. Lesson 3. Superior firepower still determines outcomes. China's defense budget rose 7%. Nuclear-powered carriers, drones, refueling vessels, electronic warfare systems, all accelerating toward 2027 readiness goals. Lesson 4. Tactical victory means nothing without political outcomes. You can destroy every air defense installation in the first hour and still not achieve your objective. The regime is not gone. The population is not surrendering. It is rallying, as populations under bombardment have done in every conflict from Korea to Vietnam to the London Blitz. Lesson 5. Self-reliance is non-negotiable. China's Beidou satellite navigation system guided strikes accurately even after the United States jammed GPS across the entire theater. That is not a technical footnote. That is validation under live combat conditions. But here is the lesson the PLA did not publish publicly, the one they kept internal, because it is the most valuable one. This entire operation is a proxy stress test for Taiwan. Beijing is analyzing American stealth fighter performance, munition depletion rates, signals intelligence integration, and, most critically, political resolve in real time. If the sanctions evasion architecture China spent years constructing can sustain commodity flows to a state under total military and economic embargo, then Beijing has just validated the exact mechanisms it would need during a blockade over Taiwan. The Shadow Fleet, the CIPS payment system, the financial conduits, all of it being graded right now under actual combat conditions. And speaking of financial systems, this is the dimension of this story that almost never makes it into the headlines. The global derivatives market carries a notional value estimated between $600 trillion and $1 quadrillion, roughly 10 times the size of the entire global economy. And backing that entire structure, approximately $300 billion in actual collateral. For every dollar of real money in the system, there are roughly $2,000 to $3,000 in derivative bets riding on top of it. A disproportionate share of those bets are tied to energy prices. When Iran attacks tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, it is not just disrupting shipping. It is moving energy prices. When it strikes fuel storage, it triggers insurance recalculations, freight surcharges, and cascading repricing across every commodity market on the planet. Banks that wrote energy derivatives contracts designed for an $80 a barrel world suddenly discover they cannot cover exposure in a $150 or $200 world. It is the insurance analogy. Everyone crashes at once, and the broker files for bankruptcy. Except the broker in this scenario is the Western financial system. Iran has been operating outside the SWIFT banking system for decades. It built offshore structures. It learned to navigate shadow financial networks. And it learned to play the derivatives market itself, placing bets on the very chaos it is generating. When Western analysts talk about pressure on Iran, they are almost always looking at the wrong instrument. Iran is not a passive victim of financial warfare. It is an active participant in it. Qatar's leadership is warning of $150 oil within weeks. The UAE just shut down the world's largest refinery, not because of a bomb, but because there is nowhere to put the output. 25% of the world's oil is currently offline. 35% of global fertilizer supply, which depends on Gulf petrochemical components, is disrupted. China, meanwhile, built its own parallel financial architecture to survive exactly this moment. The cross-border interbank payment system, known as CIPS, is processing the equivalent of $128 billion daily, entirely outside the dollar system, entirely beyond the reach of U.S. Treasury sanctions enforcement. Project mBridge, a multi-central bank digital currency platform involving China, Hong Kong, Thailand, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, surged past $55 billion in transaction volume by early 2026. A digital yuan transaction between an Iranian entity and a Chinese importer is virtually impossible for the U.S. Treasury to intercept, freeze, or even monitor. The surveillance architecture that underpins American economic statecraft, the ability to see transactions, flag them, freeze them, punish the parties involved, is blind to this system by design. And the Gulf states watched all of this unfold and drew a conclusion that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. They were not consulted before this operation launched. They did not agree to become the theater of this war. Their ports are under attack. Their oil infrastructure is being targeted. The bases that were supposed to protect them turned them into magnets for ballistic missiles. Saudi Arabia has already formed a strategic partnership with Pakistan explicitly stating it would extend its nuclear umbrella over Riyadh. Turkey is attempting to join that arrangement. Every Gulf leader is asking the same question: who exactly is the American security guarantee for? China saw this opening years ago and moved decisively. In March 2023, Beijing brokered the historic agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia to restore diplomatic relations after a 7-year freeze, achieving in one negotiation what the United States could not achieve in years. Chinese exports to the Middle East grew twice as fast as exports to the rest of the world in 2025. Chinese direct investment in the region between 2019 and 2024 approached $89 billion. The post-American Gulf era is not a prediction. It is already underway. And this operation just accelerated it by a decade. So where does all of this leave us? The United States is fighting a 21st century conflict with 20th century assumptions. It assumed air power would produce regime change. History says that has never happened without ground forces and never will. It assumed Iran would fracture under bombardment. Instead, the population is rallying. It assumed blocking the strait would strangle China. It devastated the allies America needs most. It assumed the financial system could absorb the shock, and that shock has not even fully arrived yet. What has China accomplished without firing a single shot? It validated its entire sanctions evasion architecture under real combat conditions. It collected real-time intelligence on American military capabilities and political fracture points that no espionage operation could have assembled this quickly. It watched American allies in the Gulf lose faith and begin constructing alternative security arrangements. It observed the United States burn through irreplaceable munitions that depend on Chinese-controlled supply chains for replacement, and it accelerated the construction of a post-dollar financial architecture that renders traditional American economic statecraft increasingly obsolete with each passing transaction. Colonel Douglas Macgregor called it the last act in the American theatrical production in the Middle East. When this ends, he said, America will simply get out, and everybody in the Middle East will want it out. Mearsheimer went further, calling the United States a nation addicted to war, trampling its own principles, undermining the values it claims to defend. If you live by the sword, he said, you turn yourself into a modern version of Sparta, and the end result is not going to be happy, because wars today are not just fought with weapons. They are fought with manufacturing capacity, energy security, financial resilience, and strategic patience. And in each of those dimensions, the balance of power in the global system has been quietly shifting for years. Conflicts like this one don't create that shift. They accelerate it, they reveal it, they lock it in. The people who will pay for this are not the generals who planned it or the politicians who ordered it. They are the merchant mariner on a burning tanker in the strait, the family staring at $10 a gallon at the pump, the retiree whose pension fund is one oil spike away from insolvency, the young person who cannot afford groceries because fertilizer costs tripled while strategists were busy congratulating themselves on a successful first strike. $5.2 billion, 36 hours, a significant portion of it spent punching air. The world did not change because of those strikes. The world changed because of what those strikes revealed about American doctrine, American resolve, American dependency, and American judgment. And the audience that mattered most was not in Tehran. It was in Beijing, taking notes, running models, and updating its Taiwan contingency planning with data it could not have bought at any price. So here is the question I will leave you with, not a rhetorical one, a real one that deserves a real answer. Was it worth it? And more importantly, who exactly was it worth it for? Think about that. And if this analysis gave you something the evening news did not, you already know what to do.